The steel hull of the Ventura cut through the Pacific swell with a rhythmic, heavy thud that Elias Thorne had felt in his bones for the last 12 years. It was 3 a.m., the graveyard watch, a time when the world felt like it consisted of nothing but the hum of the ship's engines and the endless, black expanse of the water. Elias leaned against the railing of the bridge wing, the salt spray cooling his face. He wasn't a man who liked the quiet, but on a patrol like this, quiet was the only thing on the menu. The Ventura was a 210-foot Coast Guard cutter, a workhorse of the fleet, but tonight she felt small. They were currently navigating a stretch of the ocean that the charts called the Solace Island Chain. In reality, it was just a collection of jagged rocks and forgotten sandbars that didn't even grow trees. Most sailors called this area the Dead Zone. It wasn't because of hauntings or legends. It was because the geography of the surrounding trenches and the high iron content in the island's rock created a natural radio shadow. Once you entered these waters, the constant chatter of the world, the weather updates, the commercial radio, the pings of satellite GPS simply faded into static. Elias adjusted his cap and looked at his watch. Another 4 hours until the sun would even think about breaking the horizon. Beside him stood a younger technician, a man named Miller, who was still trying to find his sea legs even after 6 months on duty. Miller was fidgeting with a pair of high-powered binoculars, his breath hitching every time the ship took a particularly large roll. "You ever get used to the silence out here, Thorne?" Miller asked, his voice sounding thin against the wind. Elias didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "It's not silent, Miller. You just have to learn what to listen for. The wind sounds different when it's hitting land versus when it's hitting open water. The waves break differently on a reef than they do in a deep channel. If you think it's silent, you're just not paying attention." The younger man sighed and went back to his scan. They were approaching Solace Cay, the largest of the uninhabited islands in the chain. It was a miserable place, mostly steep cliffs and sharp shale. No one lived there. No one visited there. There wasn't even a lighthouse, because the surrounding reefs were so unpredictable that the Coast Guard simply told ships to stay 20 miles clear of the entire sector. As the Ventura rounded the southern tip of the cay, Elias felt a strange sensation. It was a prickle on the back of his neck, the kind of feeling a hunter gets when he knows something in the woods has changed. He raised his own glass, the night vision optics bathing the world in a grainy mixed green. The island appeared in the lens, a jagged, ghostly spine of rock jutting out of the white foam of the surf. He scanned the shoreline. Nothing. He scanned the lower ridges. Nothing. But then, he moved the sight toward the highest peak, a flat-topped plateau that the locals called the Anvil. Elias froze. He stopped breathing for a second, wondering if it was just a trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. "Miller," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Look at the Anvil. Top right quadrant." Miller shifted his binoculars. "I don't see anything, Thorne. Just rock." "Wait for it," Elias whispered. 5 seconds passed, and 10. Then, a tiny pinprick of light emerged from the absolute darkness of the island. It wasn't a flash, and it wasn't a fire. It was a steady, deliberate glow that stayed on for exactly 3 seconds before vanishing. "Tch!" Miller nearly shouted. "A flare?" "No," Elias said, his mind racing. "Flares arch. Fires flicker." That was a fixed point. It was a signal. Who would be out there? Miller asked, his voice shaking slightly. "The last survey said, that place is a graveyard. Nothing grows there. There's no water." Elias didn't answer. He was already moving toward the bridge's interior to alert the officer of the deck as he stepped through the heavy steel door. The warmth of the bridge hit him, but he couldn't shake the chill in his chest. In his 12 years of patrolling these waters, he had seen many things drug runners. Broken-down fishing boats, even migratory whales that looked like monsters in the dark. But he had never seen a light on Solace Cay. The captain, a stern woman named Captain Vance, who had spent more time at sea than on land, was already looking at the radar screen. "Thorne, I saw the flash from the window." "What are we looking at?" Fixed light source, ma'am, Elias reported, standing at attention. Top of the ridge. It was deliberate. It stayed on for 3 seconds, off for 3. It's not a natural phenomenon, and it's not a distress flare. Vance frowned, staring at the green sweep of the radar. There are no registered vessels in this sector. Our sensors aren't picking up any heat signatures large enough to be a camp or a ship. If someone is up there, they're invisible to every piece of technology we own. The radio shadow, Elias reminded her. If they're in the pocket of the anvil, their electronics wouldn't work anyway. They'd have to be doing it the old-fashioned way. The captain looked back at the dark silhouette of the island through the thick glass of the bridge. The light pulsed again, long, short, long. That's Morse, Miller whispered from the corner. It's not SOS, Elias said, his eyes narrowing as he memorized the pattern. It's a sequence. It's almost like a greeting. The bridge fell into a heavy silence. The unexpected had arrived. For decades, Solace Cay had been a void on the map, a place where the Coast Guard simply watched the clock until they were past it. But tonight, the island was talking. And Elias Thorne had the distinct sinking feeling that whatever was waiting on those rocks had been waiting for them for a very, very long time. Slow to 5 knots, Captain Vance commanded. Prepare the boarding team. I want a rib in the water in 10 minutes. Thorne, you're leading the landing. If there's a human soul on that rock, we don't leave them behind. But stay sharp. Nobody goes to Solace Cay by accident. Elias nodded, grabbing his gear. As he headed down to the deck, the light on the island pulsed one last time, a bright amber eye in the dark. Watching them come, the descent into the water was the loudest thing Elias had ever heard. The crane groaned as it lowered the Rib the Small, rigid-hulled inflatable boat to the churning black wake of the Ventura. Usually, the sound of the engine and the spray of the ocean felt like home. But tonight, every splash felt like a warning. Elias sat at the helm, his hand gripping the throttle. Behind him were 2 other crew members, Miller and a quiet, observant medic named Reed. Keep your eyes on the surf, Elias shouted over the wind. These reefs aren't on the digital charts. They shift with the silt. If we hit a rock out here, the Ventura won't be able to get close enough to pull us out. Miller and Reed nodded, their faces pale under their helmets. As they peeled away from the mother ship, the lights of the Ventura began to shrink. In the middle of the Pacific, when you leave the big ship, you realize just how empty the world really is. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It felt heavy, like a wet blanket draped over the ocean. As they approached the shore of Solace Cay, the radio shadow Elias had mentioned earlier became absolute. The steady hum of the ships comes in their earpieces turned into a jagged, rhythmic hiss. They were officially cut off. Look at the water, Reed whispered, pointing a flashlight over the side. The water near the island wasn't blue or green. It was a milky, swirling gray, filled with pulverized shale and volcanic ash. There were no fish jumping, no dolphins following the wake. It was as if the island itself was pushing the ocean away. Elias steered the boat toward a small break. In the cliffs a narrow strip of beach he had spotted on the old paper maps back in the bridge. The boat's hull scraped against the shore with a sound like grinding teeth. The 3 men jumped out, pulling the heavy rubber craft further up the shale to keep the tide from claiming it. When Elias turned off the boat's engine, the silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house. It was a vacuum, Thorne Miller whispered, his voice barely audible. Do you hear that? Elias listened. I don't hear anything. Exactly, Miller said. No birds. We're on a tropical island in the middle of the ocean, and there isn't a single bird nesting in these cliffs. That's not right. Elias ignored the shiver running down his spine and adjusted his gear. We're here for that light. Let's move. They began the climb. The ground was treacherous, made of loose, flat stones that slid out from under their boots. Every few steps, they had to stop and catch their breath. As they climbed higher, the air began to change. It smelled of old wood smoke and something metallic like rusted iron. About halfway up the ridge, Reed stopped and shone his light toward a cluster of large boulders. Guys, over here. It wasn't a tent or a modern survival shelter. It was a hut built with such incredible precision that it almost blended into the mountain. The walls were made of driftwood, bleached white by decades of salt and sun. Woven together with thick ropes made of dried kelp and braided fishing line, Ilya stepped inside first, his hand hovering near his belt, though he didn't draw a weapon. He didn't feel a threat. He felt a deep, overwhelming sense of sadness. The interior of the hut was a marvel of human will. On a small table made of a ship's hatch cover sat 3 tin cans. They were rusted, their labels long gone, but they had been scrubbed clean and were being used as cups. In the corner, a bed of dried seagrass was neatly made. But it was the wall that caught Ilya's attention. Thousands of tiny vertical lines were scratched into the wood. They were grouped in sets of 5 tally marks. "It's been counting," Reed said, running his fingers over the scratches. "There are thousands of them. This isn't someone who got lost last week. This is someone's entire life." Miller picked up a small object from the table. It was a hand-carved wooden bird, a small albatross with its wings spread. It was beautiful, polished smooth by years of being held. "This is a ghost camp," Miller said. "Nobody could live here this long. How would they eat? Where is the water?" Elias looked at the back of the hut, where a series of hollowed-out bamboo pipes, likely scavenged from sea debris, were rigged to catch condensation dripping from the cave ceiling. It was a masterpiece of survival, but it was lonely. It was the sound of metal hitting metal. "Signal," Elias said, snapping his head toward the door. "He's starting again." They scrambled out of the hut and pushed through the final thicket of scrub brush toward the summit of the anvil. The wind was howling now, whipping at their jackets. As they cleared the final ledge, they saw the source of the light. It wasn't a fire. It was a large, brass signaling lantern, the kind used on naval destroyers during World War II. It was mounted on a heavy wooden tripod, and a figure was standing behind it. The man was thin, his hair a shock of white that whipped in the wind. But he stood with a posture that was unmistakably military. He was turning a hand crank with a steady, mechanical rhythm, sending a beam of amber light out into the void. The man didn't turn around when they approached. He didn't seem surprised. "He just kept cranking the light, sir," Elias called out, his voice cracking. "Coast Guard. We're here to help." The man stopped cranking. The silence returned, heavier than before. He slowly let go of the handle and turned around. His eyes were bright, almost glowing in the reflection of the lantern. He looked at Elias, then at Miller, then at the uniform patches on their shoulders. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask to be taken home. "You're late," the man said. His voice was raspy, like sandpaper on stone, but his tone was calm. "Late for what?" Elias asked, stepping forward. The old man pointed not toward the Ventura out at sea, but toward the opposite side of the island, the windward side, where the cliffs dropped 500 feet into a churning cauldron of white water. "I couldn't reach them," the old man said, his voice trembling for the first time. "I can see them, but I couldn't reach them. The silence. It's going to swallow them if you don't go now." Elias ran to the edge of the cliff and looked down. There, wedged between 2 teeth of rock in the middle of the surf, was the white hull of a modern yacht. It was being smashed against the stone, its lights dead, its mast snapped like a toothpick. In that moment, Elias realized the truth. This man hadn't been signaling for his own rescue. He had been a sentinel, a silent guardian of a dead island, and he was the only reason those people down there had a chance to live. The wind at the top of the anvil didn't just blow. It screamed. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the jagged cliff, his boots inches away from a 500-foot drop into a churning graveyard of white water and black rock. Down there, caught in the throat of the reef, was the yacht. It looked like a toy being broken by a giant. Every time a wave hit it, the white fiberglass hull groaned, a sound that Elias could hear even over the gale. "We can't get the rib around to that side," Miller shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "The rocks are like teeth over there. We'd be shredded before we got within 100 yards." Elias looked at the old man, the silent guardian who had spent 30 years on this rock. The man wasn't looking at the Coast Guard crew anymore. He was staring down at the wreck with a look of intense, quiet focus. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of a man who had seen this happen before and had been powerless to stop until now. The current, the old man said, his voice raspy but clear. It pulls toward the devil's throat. If that boat slips off that ledge, it goes into the deep trench. No one comes back from the trench. Elias turned to Reed, the medic. Check your bag. How much rope do we have in the kit? Not enough to rappel 500 feet, Reed said, shaking his head. And even if we did, how do we get them back up? There are kids down there, Thorne. I can see movement in the main cabin. Elias felt a heavy weight in his chest. This was the moment where training met reality. Here, on the silent island, they had a length of nylon rope, a hand-cranked lantern, and an old man who had forgotten what a city looked like. We aren't going down, Elias said, his mind spinning. We're going across, pointed to a secondary ridge that jutted out over the cove. It was lower than the anvil, maybe only 200 feet above the water, but it sat directly over the yacht's position. If they could get to that ledge, they might be able to drop a line directly onto the deck. The path to that ridge is gone, the old man interrupted. The landslide in '98 took the trail. You'd have to climb the sheer face. And we climb, Elias said. The journey to the lower ridge was a nightmare of physical endurance. The ground on Solace Cay wasn't stable. It was composed of volcanic scree that acted like ball bearings under their feet. Every step was a gamble. Miller took the lead, using a heavy flashlight to scout the footing. While Elias and Reed carried the gear, the old man followed them. Despite his age and his tattered clothes, he moved over the rocks like a mountain goat. He didn't use a light. He knew the shape of every stone, the lean of every stunted bush. He was a part of the island now. Why didn't you ever leave? Miller asked during a brief pause where they huddled against a rock to catch their breath. 30 years. You could have built a raft. You could have signaled 100 ships. I did signal. For the first 10 years, I signaled every night. No one came. The radio shadow doesn't just eat sound, son. It eats hope. Eventually, I stopped wanting to be found. I realized the world I left was gone. My wife, my parents. They would have buried a coffin with nothing in it decades ago. To them, I'm a ghost. Why haunt the living? There was no answer for that. Elias felt a lump in his throat. He thought about his own life, the months spent away from land, the missed birthdays, and the cold meals. He realized that the line between a Coast Guardsman and a castaway was thinner than he had ever imagined. They reached the lower ridge just as the tide began to turn. The change in water level was making the yacht even more unstable. It was tilting dangerously to the port side, and the sound of metal tearing was becoming constant. There, Reed yelled, pointing his light. A woman had emerged from the cabin. She was holding a small child wrapped in a bright yellow life jacket. She looked up at the cliff, her face a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. When she saw the sweep of the Coast Guard flashlights, she didn't scream. She didn't have the strength. She just collapsed onto her knees, holding the child tight. We're here, Miller roared, though there was no way she could hear him over the surf. Elias began to prep the line. Reed, you're the lightest. I'm going to anchor the rope to that rock. You're going down. Your only job is to get that kid into the harness and signal us to pull. We do this one by one. Thorne, the wind is too high, Reed said, looking at the swaying rope. I'll be slammed against the cliff face like a pendulum. Suddenly, the old man stepped forward. He reached into the folds of his ragged coat and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron hook attached to a length of braided kelp rope, the same kind Elias had seen in the hut. Use this as a secondary guide, the man said. The wind here always blows toward the north. If you angle your descent against the Lion's Head rock, the updraft will actually hold you steady. I've watched the gulls do it for 30 years. Follow the wind, don't fight it. Elias looked at the man, then at the hook. It was a piece of ancient seafaring wisdom, something you couldn't learn in an academy. They rigged the line. For several agonizing minutes, the only connection they had to him was the tension in the rope. Elias held the line with everything he had, his muscles screaming, his boots digging into the loose earth. "He's on the deck," Miller yelled, watching through binoculars. "He's got the kid." The haul back up was a test of pure human will. There was no winch, no motor. It was just Elias, Miller, and the old man standing in a row, pulling the rope hand over hand. The old man's strength was surprising. His hands were like leather, unyielding and hard. When the child, a little girl, no more than 6 years old, was finally pulled over the ledge, she was shivering and blue-lipped. But she was alive. Reed followed shortly after. Then they went back down for the mother and the father, by the time the entire family was safe on the ridge. The sun was just beginning to bleed a faint, bruised purple into the eastern sky. The yacht, as if sensing its job was done, gave one final, haunting shriek of metal and slid backward into the dark water of the trench. Within seconds, it was gone. The family huddled together, sobbing and gasping for air. The father, a man who looked like he had lost everything he owned in that boat, looked up at Elias and then at the white-haired man in the tattered uniform. "Thank you," the father whispered. We thought no one could see us." Elias looked at the old man. He was standing by his ancient lantern, watching the spot where the yacht had disappeared. He realized the real struggle was just beginning. They were still stuck on a jagged ridge miles from the Ventura, with a storm front moving in and no radio contact. They had saved the family from the sea, but now they had to survive the island. The first drop of rain didn't fall. It slapped against Elias's cheek like a cold hand. The bruised purple of the dawn was quickly being swallowed by a wall of charcoal clouds rolling in from the north. On the ocean, a storm was a challenge of seamanship. On Solace Cay, it was a death sentence. The island was made of shale and volcanic dust materials that turned into a slick, sliding mess the moment they got wet. "We can't stay on this ridge," Elias shouted. His voice strained from the night's exertion. He looked at the family they had just pulled from the jaws of the Pacific. The father, a man named Arthur, was clutching his wife, Alina, while their young daughter, Lily, was wrapped in Reed's dry tactical jacket. They were safe from the waves, but they were shivering violently, their bodies entering the first stages of hypothermia. "The RHIB is on the south beach," Miller said, checking his compass. "But if we try to go back the way we came, we'll be walking along the cliff edge in a gale. One slip, and we all go over." The old man, who had been standing silently by his signaling lantern, finally spoke. "The cliffs will weep. When the rain comes this hard, the mountain sheds its skin. You cannot go back to the beach." Elias turned to him. "Then where do we go?" "We can't stay here. These people need warmth, and they need it 10 minutes ago." The old man looked toward the center of the island, where the jagged spine of the anvil met a series of deep, shadowed ravines. "There is a vein in the rock, a lava tube that runs from the high ridge down to the sea caves near the South Cove. It's dry, and it's hidden from the wind. But we have to move now. Once the ravines flood, the entrance will be sealed." Elias hesitated. Every instinct he had as a Coast Guardsman told him to stay near the coast, to stay where the Ventura might see their lights. But he looked at the sky, and then at the trembling child. He didn't have a choice. "Lead the way," Elias said. The journey into the interior of Solace Cay was like stepping back into a prehistoric world. Without the sound of the ocean to mask it, the island felt alive. The wind whistled through the jagged rock formations, creating a low, moaning sound that made Miller keep looking over his shoulder as they walked. It wasn't the rambling of a crazy person. It was the measured observations of a man who had had nothing but time to think. "I used to hate the silence," Silas said, stepping over a deep fissure without looking down. "For the first few years, I'd scream at the top of my lungs just to hear a human voice. I'd have whole conversations with the rocks. I'd tell them about my home, about the smell of fresh-cut grass, about the way the light looks in a kitchen on a Sunday morning. What changed? Reed asked, helping Alina over a steep incline. I started listening, Silas replied. The island talks back, if you're quiet enough. It tells you when the pressure is dropping. It tells you when the deep currents are shifting. It's not a dead place. It's just an honest one. Out here, you aren't what your bank account says you are. You're just a heartbeat in the dark. Suddenly, the sky opened up. The rain wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge. Within seconds, the ground became a river of mud. Elias roared, "Link arms. Don't let go." They struggled forward, the visibility dropping to less than 10 feet. The simple hike had turned into a battle for survival. Arthur stumbled, nearly dragging Alina down with him, but Miller caught them just in time. The mud was pulling at their boots, trying to suck them down into the crevices of the rock. My wild sent with the way with I want we I get with it with my well I saw with what I reckon forgot with the way I can like why the doctor I so I but when so what's up to so I have so Silas pointed to a dark, jagged opening at the base of a towering basalt pillar. Into the throat. As Elias pushed the last of the group inside, a massive slide of mud and rock thundered down the slope they had just been standing on. Sealing the entrance behind them with a deafening crash, darkness swallowed them. "Is everyone okay?" Elias called out, his heart hammering against his ribs. A chorus of shaky yeses came back to him. Miller clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, and the beam cut through the dust-filled air. They were in a vast, tubular cavern. The walls were smooth and glass-like, formed thousands of years ago by flowing lava. It was warm, almost unnaturally sound. The sound of the storm was reduced to a distant, muffled thumping. "We're trapped," Arthur whispered, his voice echoing off the walls. "The way out is buried." "No," Silas said, his silhouette appearing in the beam of the light. "This tube runs all the way to the southern cliffs. It's the island's secret path. But we have to be careful. In the heart of the island, the silence is even heavier. And there are places where the floor simply ... ends." As they began to trek through the subterranean tunnel, the atmosphere shifted. The human-centric reality of their situation hit home. They were a group of people from two different worlds, modern rescuers, with their radios and gear. A family that had been looking for a vacation and found a nightmare. And a man who had been a ghost for 30 years. Elias walked beside Silas. "You knew that yacht was coming, didn't you?" "Before it even hit the reef," Silas nodded. "The birds left 3 days ago. They always leave when something wrong is coming. And the lantern. The lantern told me. It's been my only friend for a long time. It likes to show me things." Elias looked at the old man's hand, scarred, calloused, and steady. He realized that Silas wasn't just a survivor. He was the only reason any of them were still breathing. But as they moved deeper into the lava tube, the flashlight began to flicker. "Battery's dying," Miller muttered, shaking the light. "The cold must have drained them faster than I thought." "Don't need the light," Silas said, reaching out to touch the smooth wall of the cave. "The stone knows the way. Can you feel it? The vibration? That's the engine of your ship. The Ventura is circling the island. They're looking for us." Elias pressed his ear to the stone. At first he heard nothing. But then, deep in the marrow of the mountain, he felt it, a low, rhythmic thrum. It was the heartbeat of the cutter. "They haven't given up," Elias whispered, a surge of hope blooming in his chest. But the tunnel began to narrow, and the floor started to slope downward at a sharp angle. The smell of salt air began to mix with the warmth of the earth. They were getting close to the sea caves, but between them and the exit lay a final, terrifying obstacle, a flooded chamber where the tide was rushing in, filling the tube with freezing seawater. "We have to swim," Silas said, his voice grave. "It's the only way out to the south beach." Elias looked at Lily, the little girl. She was exhausted, her eyes half closed. He looked at the black water swirling at the end of the tunnel. This was the moment of truth. To get home, they would have to trust the silent island one last time. The water at the end of the lava tube wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that felt like needles piercing the skin. Elias stood at the edge of the submerged path, holding his dying flashlight over the swirling pool. The tide was coming in, and the sea caves were breathing. The air being pushed out by the rising water created a haunting, whistling sound that echoed through the dark chamber. "It's a 30-foot swim," Silas said, his voice steady even as his body shook from the damp air. "The ceiling dips low, so you'll have to hold your breath for about 10 seconds. Once you clear the arch, you'll pop up in the blue grotto. From there, it's a straight walk out to the south beach." Arthur held Elena's hand so tight his knuckles were white. "We can't do that. Not with Lily. She's too small. She'd panic." Elias looked at the little girl. She was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Lily, do you remember when we were on the cliff and I told you that we were the best swimmers in the world?" The girl nodded slowly. "I'm going to be right under you," Elias said, his voice soft and reassuring. "And Miller is going to be right in front of you. It's just like a game at the pool. We're going to take one big breath, and before you can even count to 10, we'll see the stars again. I promise." He looked at Miller and read. "Reed, you go first to scout the exit. Miller, you take the mother. I've got the father and the girl. Silas." Elias paused, looking at the old man. "You're with me." One by one, they slipped into the black water. When it was Elias's turn, he felt the massive weight of the island above him. He took a deep, lung-filling breath and submerged, guiding Arthur and Lily through the narrow, water-filled passage. The darkness was absolute. For a few terrifying seconds, the only thing Elias could feel was the kick of the girl's legs and the rough stone of the tunnel sealing against his back. Then the pressure vanished. They broke the surface, gasping for air in a massive cavern that glowed with a faint, ethereal blue light. The moon had broken through the storm clouds outside, and its light was reflecting through the underwater entrance. "We made it," Elena sobbed, pulling her daughter into her arms as they scrambled onto the sandy floor of the grotto. They walked out of the cave and onto the south beach. The storm was breaking, leaving behind a sky filled with more stars than Elias had ever seen, and there, about a mile offshore, was the most beautiful sight in the world, the red and white lights of the Ventura, her searchlight sweeping the coastline like the fingers of a giant. "Miller, flares." Elias commanded. Miller reached into his waterproof pouch and pulled out a signal flare. Almost immediately, the Ventura's searchlight stopped its sweep and locked onto their position. 2 short blasts of the ship's horn echoed across the water, the signal for message received. The rescue boat was on its way, as they waited on the sand. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy, quiet realization. The family was safe. The mission was over. Elias turned to find Silas, but the old man wasn't standing with the group. He was sitting on a driftwood log a few yards away. Looking back at the dark silhouette of the Anvil Ridge, Elias walked over and sat beside him. "The medics on the ship are going to want to look at you, Silas. You've had a long night." Silas smiled, a sad, distant look in his eyes. "I don't think I'm going on that boat, Elias." Elias felt a knot in his stomach. "What are you talking about? We're not leaving you here. You're a hero. You saved these people. There are people back home who will want to know what happened to you." "That's just it," Silas said softly. "The people I knew. They aren't there anymore. I'm a man out of time. If I go back, I'm just a news story for a week, and then I'm a confused old man in a hospital room, staring at a television I don't understand. Here, I know where the water is. I know what the wind means. I'm the king of this rock. You can't stay, Elias protested. The island is dangerous. You're getting older. We're all getting older, son, Silas said, standing up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, carved wooden bird he had made. He pressed it into Elias's hand. Give this to the little girl. Tell her a friend from the silent place wanted her to have it. The rib hit the shore and the fresh crew jumped out, rushing toward the family with blankets and water. In the chaos of the boarding, Elias was pulled away to give his report to the captain over the radio. When he finally turned back to the driftwood log, Silas was gone. There were no footprints in the wet sand, no rustle in the brush. It was as if the man had simply dissolved back into the shadows of the island. Thorn, let's go, Miller shouted from the boat. The tide is rising. He thought about the lantern on the tripod and the thousands of tally marks on the wall of the hut. He realized that Silas didn't need rescue. Had found exactly what he was looking for decades ago. A place where the world couldn't hurt him. And a place where he could finally be useful when it mattered most. The family was below being treated by the medical team. The sun was finally rising, turning the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold. He looked back at the highest peak of the island. For a split second, he saw a flash of amber light, a single, steady pulse. Long, short, long. A greeting. Or maybe a goodbye. Elias raised his hand and saluted the empty rock. He didn't tell the captain that Silas had stayed behind. In his official attributing the rescue to a miraculous series of atmospheric reflections. Some secrets belonged to the ocean. And as the Ventura disappeared over the horizon, Solace Cay returned to its silence, but for the first time in 30 years. The silence felt peaceful. The metal corridors of the Ventura felt different too. Elias Thorne, in the weeks following the mission at Solace Cay, the hum of the engines, which used to be a comforting lullaby, now felt like a constant reminder of the noise of the modern world. Every time a radio crackled or a satellite phone rang, Elias found himself thinking of the absolute, heavy silence of the cave where he had sat next to Silas. He held the wooden bird in his pocket almost every day. The smooth grain of the wood a physical anchor to a night that felt more like a dream than a tactical operation. Back at the base, the debriefing had been long and exhausting. Elias sat in a windowless room with 3 officers who wanted to know every detail of the light source. He stuck to his story. He told them about the yacht, the family, the treacherous climb, and the strange hand-cranked lantern. Why? But when they asked about the man, Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest. He described the survivor in vague terms, claiming the man had disappeared into the brush during the frantic evacuation of the family. You're telling us an 80-year-old man just vanished into a rock face while your team was 10 feet away? One of the officers asked, leaning forward. The terrain is volcanic, sir, Elias replied, his voice flat and professional. There are thousands of cracks and crevices. If someone doesn't want to be found on that island, they won't be. My priority was the children and the parents. They eventually let it go. The rescue of the family was such a massive public relations win for the Coast Guard that the mystery of the hermit became a secondary footnote in the official files. But for Elias, it was the only thing that mattered. 3 months later, Elias was granted a 2-week leave. Most sailors would have headed for the nearest city or a quiet beach resort. But Elias found himself driving a rented truck toward a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest. He had done some digging in the old naval archives during his off hours. He wasn't looking for a ghost. He was looking for a name. He found it in a dusty ledger from 1984, a small research vessel named the Silver. Finn had been reported missing during a freak storm. On board were 3 scientists and 1 young naval navigator. The navigator's name was Silas. There were no photos in the file, just a brief description. Skilled in celestial navigation, known for a calm demeanor under pressure, Elias tracked. Down a small, weathered house overlooking the gray waters of the Sound. An elderly woman lived there, her garden filled with the same kind of wind-swept shrubs that grew on Solace Cay. She was the sister Silas had left behind. He was always a quiet boy, she told Elias as they sat on her porch. She didn't cry. She had done her grieving 30 years ago. He loved the stars more than he loved the land. When the ship went missing, the Navy told us there were no survivors. They said the current in that sector was too strong. Elias looked at her, his heart heavy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden bird. He didn't say it was from Silas. He simply said he had found it on an island during a patrol and thought she might like to see the craftsmanship. The woman took the bird, her fingers trembling as she traced the wings. Silas used to carve these, she whispered, her eyes widening. He'd make them for me whenever we went to the shore. How? How did this get all the way out there? The ocean has a way of carrying things to where they belong, Elias said softly. He didn't tell her brother was still alive, living on a rock in the middle of a radio shadow. He realized that Silas was right to the world. He was a peaceful memory. To bring him back now would be to break the stillness he had worked so hard to find. Elias returned to the Ventura, a changed man. He no longer saw his job as just patrolling a border or checking fishing permits. He saw himself as a witness to the things people usually ignored. He became the officer who spent the most time looking through the long-range glass. Not at the ships, but at the empty spaces between the waves. A year to the day after the rescue. The Ventura was once again scheduled to pass through the Solace Island chain. The crew was different. Miller had been promoted and moved to a different cutter, and Reed was teaching at the academy. Elias was the only one left who remembered the sound of the mudslide and the smell of the lava tube. As the ship approached the dead zone, the bridge grew quiet. The new recruits had heard the stories. Of course, the legend of the ghost light, but they treated it like a ghost story told around a campfire. Approaching Solace K, the navigator announced, "Radio signal dropping. We're in the shadow." Kalis walked out onto the bridge wing. The air was cold and crisp. The island appeared on the horizon, a dark, jagged tooth against the twilight sky. It looked exactly the same. No trees, no lights, no signs of life. Elias raised his binoculars and focused on the anvil. The ridge was empty. He felt a pang of worry. Had the old man finally succumbed to the elements? Had the silence finally claimed him? Just as he was about to turn away, he noticed something different. On the beach where they had waited for the rescue boat, there was a stack of stones. It was a cairn, a tall, perfectly balanced pillar of shale. On top of the pillar sat something white. Elias adjusted the focus. It was a life jacket, the bright yellow jacket they had wrapped the little girl in a year ago. It wasn't discarded. It was tied to a driftwood pole, snapping in the wind like a flag. It was a signal of a different kind. It wasn't a cry for help, and it wasn't a warning. It was a message of survival. Silas was still there. He had cleaned the beach, he had built a monument to the night they saved those people, and he was letting Elias know that the ghost was still on watch. Elias leaned over the railing, took a deep breath of the salt air. He realized that everyone is looking for something, some are looking for home. Some are looking for fame, and some are just looking for a place where the noise stops. "Everything okay, Thorne?" the captain asked, stepping out onto the wing. Elias looked at the yellow flag on the distant beach, then back at the horizon. "Everything is fine, Captain," Elias said, a small smile touching his lips. "It's just a quiet night." As the Ventura sailed past, the radio static in Elias's headset suddenly cleared for a brief second. He didn't hear a voice, and he didn't hear a song. He heard the rhythmic, steady sound of a hand-cranked lantern turning a faint, mechanical heartbeat that told him the island was in good hands. The unexpected had become a part of him. And as the island faded into the mist behind them, Elias Thorne knew that he would never truly be alone on the ocean again. He was part of the silence now, and the silence was full of life.